The World Health Organization's pandemic agreement has been in the news a lot lately. Not only does this United Nations organization want the power to take over the world in a health emergency, but numerous politicians and commentators keep claiming that if Joe Biden signs this treaty, it would be legally binding in the United States. Truth is, that's just not true, for several reasons. So we'll discuss that next on the Constitution Study.
Neighbors and have a few good friends. Every day we're everyday Americans. Oh, every day we're everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans. Paul Engel here with the Constitution Study, where we read and study the Constitution. Teach our generation to be free, and I'm glad you could join me today. You know, we all need a boogeyman, somebody we can point to and say, the end of the world is coming and here's the proof. Well, this WHO treaty is a boogeyman. Well, yes and no, because there is a lot of evil in it, and it's going to be used to do a lot of bad things. But if we know the truth, well, the truth will set us free. Now, you can find more about this article I wrote and all the links at the webpage constitutionstudy.com. We'll talk a bit more about the website at the end of the episode. But for now, let's take a look at this pandemic agreement. With all of this talk about the WHO treaty, you might be surprised to find out it doesn't call itself a treaty. Rather, its actual title is the WHO Pandemic Agreement. This detail will become important later in this episode. As you may expect, this agreement starts with some grandiose statements, many of which are just grandly wrong. Recognizing that the World Health Organization is fundamental to strengthening pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, as it is the directing and coordinating authority on international health work. As more and more information comes to light, we find the recommendations from WHO regarding lockdowns, masks, and the mRNA vaccines, but in question how effective they were in preventing the spread of the pandemic. Which brings into question the purpose of this agreement. The objective of the WHO Pandemic Agreement, guided by equity and the principles and approaches set forth herein, is to prevent, prepare for, and respond to pandemics. Who would decide how to prevent, prepare, and respond to pandemics under this agreement? It shouldn't surprise anyone that it would be the bureaucrats in the WHO calling the shots. While much of the agreement's language is fairly vague, that doesn't mean there aren't problems. For example, language like this. The parties commit to take measures to progressively strengthen pandemic prevention and coordination, multi-sectoral surveillance, taking into account national capacities and national and regional circumstances. The parties shall contribute to the further development and updating of international standards and guidelines to detect, reduce risk of, monitor, and manage zoonotic spillover and spillback in collaboration with WHO and relevant intergovernmental organizations. And each party commits to develop, strengthen, and maintain its health system, including primary health care for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, taking into account the need for equity and resilience with the view of the progressive realization of universal health coverage. There's plenty of room in this language for the WHO to claim sovereignty over every country that signs on. This becomes quite apparent when you start reading Article 19 of the agreement. The parties shall cooperate directly and/or through relevant regional and international bodies to substantially strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response capacities in countries, particularly developing countries, which are parties to the WHO Pandemic Agreement or the International Health Regulations 2005, herein referred to collectively as cooperating parties. The parties shall, upon request, facilitate the provision of technical assistance and support for those cooperating parties that have requested such assistance or support, in particular developing countries either bilaterally or through relevant regional and/or international organizations. Now, what are these cooperating parties supposed to cooperate on? Sharing technical, scientific, and legal expertise. And financial support as well. The part that got my attention was the inclusion of the international health regulations into this agreement. As you may have heard, there have been some interesting amendments proposed to these regulations. Amendments like standing recommendations means Advice issued by WHO for specific ongoing public health risks pursuant to Article 16 regarding appropriate health measures for routine or periodic application needed to prevent or reduce the international spread of disease and minimize interference with international traffic. Temporary recommendations means advice issued by WHO pursuant to Article 15 for application on a time-limited, risk-specific basis in response to a public health emergency of international concern, so as to prevent or reduce the international spread of disease and minimize interference with international traffic. Notice how these recommendations would no longer be non-binding. I guess that means the WHO would consider these recommendations legally binding on parties to these agreements. Furthermore, these amended regulations have an amended purpose. The purpose and scope of these regulations are to prevent, protect against, prepare, control, and provide a public health response to the international spread of disease, including through health system readiness and resilience in ways that are commensurate with and restricted to the public health risk, all risks with a potential to impact public health, and which avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade, livelihoods, human rights, and the equitable access to health products and healthcare technologies and know-how. There are also some fundamental principles that need to be considered. The implementation of these regulations shall be guided by the goal of their universal application for the protection of all people of the world from the international spread of disease. When implementing these regulations, parties and WHO should exercise precaution, in particular when dealing with unknown pathogens. Even with this brief look at these two documents, I hope you can see why so many people are concerned about the loss of sovereignty should the Biden administration sign on to these two agreements. However, there are constitutional issues we need to examine as well. To truly understand the lie that is being told about this agreement, we need to start with an examination of the treaty and supremacy clauses. No president has the authority to sign a treaty on their own. As Article 2 clearly states, the president, he shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So if Joe Biden follows through with his promise to sign the WHO pandemic agreement, legally it will be meaningless in the United States unless and until the Senate consents to it. But Paul, you say, this is not a treaty, it's an agreement. While some have claimed that the president can bind the United States to international agreements as long as they are not called treaties, that isn't true. Look at the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively to the people. Read the Constitution, and you'll not find the power to sign binding international agreements delegated to the president. The only place the power to sign such agreements lies is in the treaty clause, which requires both the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, what if the Senate consents to this agreement? Wouldn't that make it legally binding? This leads us to the supremacy clause. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. In order for any treaty to be considered the supreme law of the land, it must be made under the authority of the United States. Where does the United States get its authority? From the Constitution, of course. So in order for a treaty or any treaty-like device to be considered legally binding on the United States, the several states, and any of its people, it must exercise a power that the Constitution has already delegated to the United States. Look very closely. You will not find the power to regulate public health delegated to the United States. You may ask, but what if it's an emergency? Look again. You'll see there is no emergency clause in the Constitution. That means whether or not an American president signs the agreement or the accompanying international health regulations, these rules are not legally binding upon the United States. They will only have an effect if the American people are distracted by lies. As a young boy, I learned about a game played in the streets of New York City, a game you could not win. The game is called three-card Monte. A variation of the shell game, it works by distracting the mark while you play with the cards. Something very similar appears to be happening with the WHO agreement. See, just as the Monte dealer cries out, "Watch the lady, keep track of the lady," people today are crying, "If Joe Biden signs this agreement, American sovereignty will end." Nothing any president can do can take away your sovereignty. Sadly, most Americans have voluntarily given up their sovereignty by falling for the lies that the president can do things via international agreement that he cannot do under the Constitution. Let's picture a future where some American president has signed the WHO pandemic agreement and the international health regulations, and the Senate has ratified these treaties. What happens then? First, since these treaties were not made under the authority of the United States, they are not the supreme law of the land. Further, the signing of these treaties would be an unconstitutional act. As the Supreme Court confirmed in the case Norton v. Shelby County, an unconstitutional act is not a law. It confers no rights. It imposes no duties. It affords no protection. It creates no office. It is in legal contemplation as inoperative as though it had never been passed. Then again, since members of Congress seem almost universally ignorant of the document they took an oath to support, I'm sure the vast majority would think these false treaties valid. However, any legislative acts made in support of these fake treaties would not be constitutional and therefore void. As Alexander Hamilton said in Federalist 78, there is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. To deny this would be to affirm that the deputy is greater than his principal, that the servant is above his master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves, that men, acting by virtue of powers, may do not only what their powers do not authorize, but what they forbid. Since neither the president nor Congress is likely to recognize the criminal activities they were committing, many would look to the courts to protect us. Since these justices went to the same law schools that refused to teach the supreme law of the land, can we really expect protection from this branch of government? A quick look at the Supremacy Clause should show you not only that the decisions of a court is not part of the supreme law of the land, but that the judges are bound to the Constitution, not the other way around. Of course, that will not stop those in government at all levels from turning their back on their oaths of office and attempting to place free citizens under the thumb of these tyrannical treaties, which leaves us with one way to protect our rights and where we should have started in the first place, with we the people. So where does this leave us? I fully expect President Biden will sign the WHO pandemic agreement. Why would he do so? I believe that's pretty obvious as well. There are forces in the world that believe they know better than everyone else how we should live our lives, how we should spend our money, and how we should treat an emergency like a pandemic. The only way these people can have that kind of power is by creating a government above the nations. That is what the United Nations has become, and with the help of the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, and our own sellouts in the United States, they will subjugate us to the will of others. I'm reminded of the famous picture from Tiananmen Square, the one of a single man standing before a tank, a single man standing for his rights and those of his family, a single man, alone, but willing to do what is right. I don't think those who would stand against these treaties would be alone. I believe there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of Americans who recognize that the Constitution of the United States is their legal authority to stand athwart those who would implement these fake treaties and say no. They recognize that there is not a court, legislature, or executive in this country who can legally violate the supreme law of the land and are willing to stand for that conviction. Because anyone who would sign such an agreement, vote for legislation to implement such an agreement, or decide a case in favor of such an agreement is not merely acting against their oath of office. They're committing insurrection, a rising or rebellion of citizens against their government, usually manifested by acts of violence. You see, the dirty little secret that everyone seems to be forgetting is that in the United States, the government is not the person in office, but the office is created by the Constitution. And when someone attempts to subvert the words of the Constitution, they are subverting the only legal government for the United States. Should these international organizations attempt to subvert the Constitution, it could be said they are levying war against the United States, meaning anyone who gave them aid and comfort would be committing treason. If you followed the Constitution study for any length of time, you should know I do not use that term treason lightly. Our universal ignorance of the Constitution, especially the Supremacy Clause, has led a lot of presidents to do things by international agreement. Forget the term treaties, so they don't think they need to approve it by Congress. They don't need the advice and consent of the Senate. That's our fault. It's time we stop. It's time we realize that this WHO agreement, this treaty, can never be legally binding in the United States unless the American people allow it. Unless we stand back, push the Constitution aside, and let the tyrants walk right in. It's up to us. It's up to you and me. We don't need the government to fix it. We need you and me to understand this. We need to educate our local government offices of the Constitution and their oath to it and what that truly means. We need to educate our state legislatures about the tyranny of these, about the illegalness, the even treasonous acts of trying to turn our constitutional republic into a subject of an international organization. We need to educate at least to the state level. Because if the states get involved, if the states learn this truth, DC won't matter. That's the other dirty little secret. We keep focusing on DC. DC doesn't matter. DC is a distraction. DC only has power because the states allow it to. And the states only have power because the people allow it to. It's called the consent of the governed. If we want to learn this, well, then head to the website, constitutionstudy.com. And in fact, check out the Patriots program. You'll find it on the menu, or just go to constitutionstudy.com/patriots. It's where we're learning about the truth about the Constitution, its power, the tools it provides us, and how we can use them. It's also where we're building a communication network where we can talk to amongst ourselves without the censors getting in the way, so we can know what's going on in the different cities and states. Maybe we can provide advice or help or just be there. We're also setting up the Minutemen. We're men and women that are trained and ready to step in at a moment's notice to help defend the Constitution and our rights. But that only happens if people join us. The Patriot program is growing, and you can be a part of it. Just, again, go to constitutionstudy.com/patriots. Take the boot camp. It's invitation only, so you got to take the boot camp, which is absolutely free, and you'll learn something, so that's kind of cool. And then if you're interested, take the test, sign the oath, and you'll get the invitation to join us here. The point is, we are not as powerless as we have been led to believe. There's power in the people. Sovereignty rests in us, not in DC, not in Joe Biden, not in our states, in us. That's where the source of sovereignty is. And if we would simply wake up and stand, we can change the world. It only works if you join us and you help us do this. Whether it's by spreading the news about the Constitution Study, whether it's about supporting me by buying books or donating to the cause. Whatever you can do to help spread the word and encourage the work that we're doing, I would greatly appreciate it. And I hope that includes coming back next time, maybe even to bring a friend or two to the Constitution Study.